Most people assume the United States maintains its status as the world's ultimate superpower strictly through its massive military budget or nuclear arsenal. While those certainly help, they aren't the primary engine. Washington commands an invisible economic weapon that often exerts more leverage than any fleet of aircraft carriers, a financial framework known as the petrodollar system. The petrodollar functions as a global financial architecture where every transaction for crude oil, regardless of which nations are buying or selling, must be cleared using the U.S. dollar. Because oil powers human civilization, running the transportation, manufacturing, and utility grids every nation requires to survive, pricing it in dollars forces every country on Earth to stockpile greenbacks. This dynamic grants Washington unprecedented control over global trade. To understand how Washington engineered this structure, we have to look back to 1944. During the Bretton Woods Agreement, 44 nations agreed to tie their currencies to the U.S. dollar, which was at the time strictly backed by physical gold. But as the U.S. began spending heavily to fund the Cold War and the Vietnam War, its financial obligations rapidly outpaced its gold reserves. They were printing more paper than they had metal to cover. Facing a potential default, President Richard Nixon unilaterally severed the dollar from physical gold in 1971, a historic geopolitical event known as the Nixon Shock. This pivot turned the dollar into unbacked paper. With its value now fluctuating wildly, the United States was forced to urgently seek a new mechanism to secure global demand for its currency. The opportunity arrived during the chaos of 1973. Amid the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil-producing nations engineered a massive embargo against Western powers who had supported Israel. The embargo caused devastating fuel shortages and skyrocketing prices in the West. But it also severely damaged Saudi Arabia, because refusing to sell oil drastically reduced their own state revenues. Recognizing that the standoff was hurting both sides, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia reached an undercover diplomatic agreement in 1974. Washington guaranteed permanent military protection and advanced hardware to the House of Saud. In exchange, Saudi Arabia committed to pricing and selling its crude oil strictly in U.S. dollars, and then reinvesting the profits into American financial markets. Because Washington was the only power capable of guaranteeing their security, the rest of OPEC quickly followed suit. Through this single diplomatic operation, the U.S. replaced the gold standard with an oil standard. By leveraging global energy demands, Washington cemented the dollar's global supremacy. When a foreign nation buys oil, they pay in U.S. dollars. Saudi Arabia reinvests those billions directly into U.S. Treasury bonds. Economists call this petrodollar recycling. Buying government bonds effectively lends capital, providing the U.S. with an automatic, uninterrupted stream of incredibly cheap credit. Because all of these global oil transactions are executed in dollars, they have to pass through U.S.-regulated clearing banks. This grants Washington the unique leverage to freeze hostile nations out of the global financial network via sanctions. The recycling framework acts as a perpetual motion machine. It forces foreign nations to constantly finance the American economy just to secure the energy they need to keep their own lights on. But this leverage forces the United States to absorb a massive macroeconomic drawback. For the system to function smoothly, the global economy requires a constant, abundant supply of circulating dollars to actually buy that oil. This graphic shows the petrodollar paradox. When the U.S. exports goods, it pulls dollars back home. When it imports goods, it pumps dollars outward. The only way to supply the international market with enough cash is to import significantly more physical goods than it exports. Washington must run a permanent trade deficit to maintain global liquidity. While the inbound loans from petrodollar recycling help cover the gap, it explains why the U.S. national debt is continuously hitting astronomical records. If the U.S. shifted to a trade surplus, global dollar liquidity would dry up, and foreign countries would be forced to find alternative currencies. This staggering national debt is a mandatory structural cost to keep the whole framework running. After 50 years of uninterrupted dominance, the petrodollar is facing serious structural challenges. The expanding BRICS alliance is actively planning to shift bilateral trade networks toward local currencies, pushing for de-dollarization. One specific threat is the rise of the petroyuan. Beijing and Riyadh have entered advanced negotiations to bypass the dollar entirely, clearing oil sales using Chinese yuan and Saudi riyals. The second major risk comes from the rapid global pivot toward electric infrastructure, renewable energy, and green technology. As the global economy requires less crude oil, the total volume of international oil trade will contract. A shrinking market means a reduced global requirement for petrodollars, directly neutralizing Washington's greatest geopolitical lever. Even if the petrodollar collapses tomorrow, the U.S. economy won't simply vanish. The greenback is already deeply hardwired into the architecture of international banking and corporate trade. However, losing the oil monopoly would permanently strip Washington of its ultimate financial advantage. Without that automatic stream of inbound capital, the U.S. economy would be forced to undergo a painful, massive structural adjustment. The invisible systems controlling global wealth are fragile, and when the energy dynamic shifts, the entire global financial order shifts right along with it. If you want to break free and decode the systems controlling our world, hit subscribe right now. Let's map it out together.